For far too long in Diablo 4, I think that we have all been enslaved to the meta, to the S tier builds, only ever asking the question, what is the best? As opposed to asking the question, what can you possibly do? And for that, I'd like to introduce you to the Shademist Necromancer. Now, what you're watching here is a tier 5 Infernal Hordes, nothing impressive at all, and in fact, I don't really recommend this build for something much harder than this. This build is not going to push you as far as possible into the pit. It is not going to speedrun tier 8 hordes. No, it really is begging the question, what can you do with the new stuff that's in the game? And if I'm willing to put together a weird enough assortment of bugs, weird unintentional interactions, and completely bananas mechanics, what can you do? And that's perfectly where the Shademist Necromancer fits into the landscape of Diablo 4 builds. Now, this is the last disclaimer that I'm going to make because I really hate the concept of trying to hype you up about a subpar build just because I think it's interesting, and I more so just wanted to explore all of those things that if anybody were to ask me, I'd say it's probably not worth your time, it's not the best that you can do, and instead ask the question, what is the best that this thing can do now that we can build it? The Shademist Necromancer revolves around the new aspect, Shademist. The aspect says that your minions are now going to deal shadow damage per second to enemies around them, and that damage will last for a certain amount of time, The aura exists in a small area around your minions, and there is a lot of confusion around this aspect, which is one of the primary motivators for why I wanted to A, build into it, and 2, get this video out, because I think it would save a lot of people time of their own research, resources, respecking, tempering, etc. So let me go ahead and break down what the build's general concept is, and then we'll go over the actual mechanics about Shademist, because there's a lot of bugs to cover in this one, all of which I've already reported and theoretically the devs are aware of, but there's a big old rabbit hole here that you're probably going to want to go down with me to better understand it. Shademist's damage, how it scales, really doesn't matter here. All that matters is every single minion on the field will now apply an aura around them damage over time that is shadow damage. This allows us to proc a lot of things in the game that are typically very difficult to proc efficiently. Most notably, Shadow Blight, the recently buffed key passive, and on top of that, one of the bugs with Shademist, which I'll just cover very lightly here, is the fact that it carries lucky hit chance. Now for people who don't know, nothing in the game is supposed to have lucky hit chance unless it is a skill that has a lucky hit chance number attached to it. Minions aren't supposed to proc Abhorrent Decrepify. Random things like Indariel's Visage, that AoE damage, is not meant to proc things like X-Fall's Ring. But Shademist is bugged, and it is an exception. From what I can tell, it has a very high base coefficient of lucky hit chance. I'll be able to properly show you that later in Kyovashad. But because of this, we're able to proc 2 systems fairly regularly. One for single target damage and one for AoE damage. X-Fall's Ring says that your damage over time effects have a 75% chance of triggering a huge base damage of whatever damage type it was. And since Shademist does shadow damage over time, X-Fall's Ring does shadow damage in an explosion. It's going to hit the target itself and everything around it. That's how we clear the density. Shadow Blight, the key passive on the other hand, says every 8 times that you would deal damage to a target, take a low base damage coefficient of 44% of our weapon damage and apply it as shadow damage to that target as well. This can crit, it reads vulnerable, it can't overpower, but on top of that, it actually scales with shadow damage over time, or any damage over time stat that you put on your build. What this means is that in properly calibrating how much damage over time you have, which doesn't really increase Shadow Blight's base damage, and then critical strike damage you have, you can basically create 2 different buckets, which when multiplied together get a much bigger return on damage. So think about it this way, if I had 1,000 additive damage, I would multiply Shadow Blight's damage by 11. If I instead had 500 additive damage, like critical strike damage, and 500 shadow damage over time, I have a 6 times multiplier over here and a 6 times multiplier over here. As opposed to just an 11 times multiplier, I instead get a 36 times multiplier. That's how we're going to scale this damage. And the rest of what we want to do is to be able to enable both our survivability, our pet survivability, and then adding on as many lucky hit chance procs as possible, be able to trigger both X-Falls as often as possible, but also the amazing cooldown engine in the form of Abhorrent Decrepify. We're going to use Grasping Veins on Corpse Tendrils for even more critical strike chance. We're going to use the critical strike chance from Bone Storm as well to be able to reach 100% critical strike chance when both of these effects are up. And since we're able to reset our cooldown so quickly, we should have 100% uptime on both of them, depending on how good your gear is. Add on to that yet another bugged interaction in the form of Aphotic. Aphotic says that whenever you use Raised Skeleton, your skeletal warriors will now deal shadow damage. And while it's generally cool for being able to increase how often we are triggering Shadow Blight, it's much more important the second part of this effect, which says that they have a 20% chance to be able to stun an enemy. For whatever reason, whenever your minions actually stun a target through Aphotic, this triggers Abhorrent Decrepify. Another bug that made it all the way through the PTR and in fact last season, but here we are. This is the biggest total contributor to our cooldown reduction that we can possibly get. The last interesting interaction that you really need to be aware of is the fact that Bone Prison also counts as minions. If you look around Bone Prison, you'll notice these weird little shadowy appendages, this little smoke coming off of it. That's right, Bone Prison counts as 6 minions standing around the target simultaneously, each one of them doing an instance of damage twice per second. That's 12 instances per second. Bone Prison will proc Shadow Blight more than once per second just by itself. And then lastly, you're going to go ahead and toss in Blight. Why? Because Blight has a really high base lucky hit chance. The instant that Blight hits, it can apply its lucky hit chance, and the shadow damage over time that leaves on the ground can also proc lucky hit chance. So the pool on the ground can proc X falls, the initial hit can proc things like Abhorrent Decrepify and Crippling Darkness, as well as lucky hit chance to be able to freeze targets from our gear, which is important because of our passives. And what you're looking at is a hilariously broken, weird and bugged combination or constellation of basically shouldn't work this way, lucky hit proc positive feedback loop, where everything's feeding into this one general pool of doing an okay amount of DPS. Alrighty, now that I've sold you on the build, let's go ahead and talk about the gear and the aspects and the uniques that we're using just very quickly so we can skip ahead. I'll have a planner down to everything down below, and I can't stress this enough. Again, if you're trying to push the hardest content in the game, if you're trying to find your one build to play, don't do this. But if you got extra gear lying around, you just want to be trying out something now that we're more than a week into the season, and you've been generally curious about this aspect, here's a roadmap of something that you can try out just for fun, just to see how well you can push with it. But let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room before we get anywhere else. Yes, I have a Shaco. Yes, I double Masterwork crit on cooldown reduction. Yes, it's incredibly powerful. Luckily for us, the +4 skill ranks actually doesn't really do anything other than reduce our cooldowns even further because none of our damage is really coming from our skills here. But yes, it's incredibly powerful. Everybody can choose to have one mythic unique throughout the season as long as you have dropped one throughout the season. So if you really want a Shaco, you can have a Shaco. If you don't have one yet, you can absolutely use a legendary helmet. I'll have one in the build planner down below. I'll have a mythics version, and I'll have a non-mythics version, just for people who haven't gotten lucky enough to be able to drop one. For the chest piece, most important things are going to be maximum life for survivability and essence per second to be able to cast Blight without really having to worry about it. You definitely want corpse tendril size to be able to pull in as many things in the Infernal Horde as possible, because the more monsters within an area, the better. Use the timestamp for the mechanics section to better understand that, but that is incredibly important. This is where we're putting Shielding Storm for effective immunity to all damage, since the more monsters around you, the more barrier you generate per second with this thing. It's an absolute powerhouse. For the gloves, you would want critical strike chance and lucky hit chance. On top of that, either intelligence or attack speed or maximum life, whatever you manage to get. You need any lucky hit chance to be able to apply a hard crowd control here. You would most typically want it to be freeze. While freeze isn't the strongest lucky hit chance stun effect that you can apply to a target, it's very important for our passive skill tree we'll touch on in a second. Then for the aspect, we're going to be using Cursed Aura. Cursed Aura will apply whatever type of curse we currently have, as well as curses that we don't have. So if you put points into Iron Maiden, it will read as if you have cast Iron Maiden. The really important thing about this is that it will spread your curses to targets within range, as long as things are somewhere within the area of the aura. This means that we are cursing targets without having to cast anything on them immediately, and it then spreads to everything that spawns in. Enemies being cursed is incredibly important for us because it's going to activate multiple glyphs in our Paragon system, as well as applying our crowd control and damage reduction effects, and making it so that whenever our minions randomly trigger Abhorrent Decrepify on targets around us, we don't have to have manually cursed them ourselves. Can you do more damage without this? Sure. Do I feel like the gameplay really was terrible without this? absolutely, I would highly recommend it. For the pants, maximum life, intelligence, armor, and total armor. This is where you manage your armor in general. Again, lucky hit chance to be able to apply freeze. This is where putting aphotic, again, for the bugged interaction to be able to not only stun targets, not only have our warriors do shadow damage for shadow blight procs, but also to trigger abhorrent to crapify for cooldown reduction. For the boots, more essence per second, movement speed, and intelligence, lucky hit chance for freeze, more movement speed, and then this is where we're putting occult dominion. Since Shademist procs off of each one of our minions on every single target within their area, the more minions, the more procs. Pretty simple math there. For the amulet, I would realistically want gloom ranks as well as lucky hit chance and critical strike chance here. If your crit is already managed, you can go with terror ranks or anything, something similar to maybe even Death's Embrace, which I actually really like as a passive. Gives you a little bit of damage to close as well as damage reduction. Don't sleep on that. We're going to go with either resource cost reduction or resource generation, and then critical strike damage. Maybe thinking like, oh, isn't this a shadow build? Don't we want shadow build tempers? Fun fact, the only shadow build tempers are either shadow damage over time, which is not a dead stat for us, but then will not actually scale the base of Shadow Blight's damage as well as X-Fall's damage. But the only other one is actually darkness skill damage. Basically, nothing of what we're doing is actually a darkness skill. Blight is a darkness skill which does shadow damage. They are not interchangeable there. So we very much want critical strike damage as our temper as opposed to any of the other more niche ones. Here we're putting decay. Decay is the thing that actually scales Shadow Blight. It says that every single time that you would trigger Shadow Blight, increase the damage that Shadow Blight does by 68%, and this stacks up to 5 times. That means that in the end, it increases your Shadow Blight damage by 340%. That is a 4.4 times multiplier, and this is significantly stronger than putting anything like Damned or Blighted up here. If you do the math, this one ends up increasing your overall damage more than the other one would. For the one ring which you can use, critical strike chance as well as lucky hit chance, again, resource cost reduction or resource generation, either maximum life or intelligence for more damage, and then crit for the temper. We're going to go ahead and put Shademist here. Doesn't matter what your Shademist roll is, the damage on it does not matter. The only thing that really matters is the length of time that it is applied. Since our minions are going to be running around all the time and monsters are going to be running away from them, the perfect time on the length is the largest total multiplier of your efficiency. Obviously, we want an X-Falls ring. The damage value on X-Falls is the most important stat on this piece of gear, followed by the lucky hit chance, then the damage over time, then the all stats, then the vulnerable. Does it really matter? No. You want perfect lucky hit chance, you want perfect damage on it, and then everything else is kind of whatever you get. For the offhand is going to naturally give us lucky hit chance, which is obviously very important to be able to proc X-Falls and all the other systems that we've talked about. But on top of that, we would want more critical strike chance, more lucky hit chance. You could go with cooldown reduction. I personally went with intelligence. Then here we're going to be putting on Blight cast twice, so that every single time that we cast Blight, there's a chance of 2 of them shooting out, doubling how much lucky hit chance we get per cast. And then on top of that, this is where we're going to be putting Grasping Veins. For the weapon, while I messed up the tempers here, you want intelligence, maximum life, and then damage over time. I'm using an axe for even more damage over time. And you'll also notice I've slotted in damage over time gems. Other than this weapon and those gems, you really don't want to have damage over time on any other sources other than in your Paragon and on X-Falls. More chance for Blight to cast twice, and then I actually bricked the damage temper. You would much rather have critical strike damage here than overpower, which we can't actually proc. Our last aspect for this build is going to be the Damned. Damned increases our shadow damage. All the damage that we do is shadow damage. It also applies to cursed targets, which is why the cursed aura becomes so important. Now that we have hit the Kiyoshad dummy training room, anybody who isn't a hyper nerd can go ahead and check out the next video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you saw, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video as well. Leave a comment down below with whatever you'd like to ask about. But we're going to get into the nitty gritty here. If you're not down for that, I totally understand. I don't want to bore you until the end. But for you big old nerds out there, let's start talking about Shademist and the information that we can deduce from what it does. Now, first and foremost, to understand it, we have to look at it attacking this little here dummy with a single minion out. Now what you're currently looking at is X-Falls ring going off. It's that purple explosion that was doing like 1 million, 2 million damage there with crits. That's what we're looking for to be able to prove that Shademist actually carries lucky hit chance. Let me go ahead and summon a single one of my minions. I'm not going to do anything else. And bada bing, bada boom, like right on cue there, it triggered our X-Falls ring. Now you'll also notice, given it enough time, that it will randomly apply freeze to this target. It will apply any of the effects, like right there it actually just applied slow, which is kind of wild bananas, but like here we are. And there we go, we got the freeze. All of those are lucky hit effects from our gear, not something that the minion naturally does. So you'll notice that the damage coming off of it is very static. Now, obviously it's going to change depending on whether or not it's crowd controlled, etc., based off our glyphs, but it is doing a consistent amount of damage. The more of your minions that are around this target, the more damage you're going to do, but it's going to scale linearly with the number of targets around it. Bone Prison will now be applying basically 6 times that amount of damage to the target because there are 6 minions around the target. We're going to use that to our advantage. But now that we know that it applies lucky hit chance as well as proccing from our Bone Prison, the big thing that we're actually looking at here is how it interacts with Shadow Blight. So we're going to look right here for the decay aspect. The decay aspect is going to add up over time up to a total of 5 ranks. So I'll summon all my Bone Prisons. And you'll notice that we do an instance of damage very, very quickly. In fact, we're doing more than 1 per second, and our decay aspect has triggered. As that damage over time runs out, this will eventually run out as well. But if I were to summon all of my minions with enough things going off simultaneously, and gosh, is that loud? Let me go ahead and turn it down for a hot second here. Well, you'll notice with enough of our minions around them very quickly that our decay is triggering more than once per second here. And this damage off to the side is the damage that we're doing. All this like little piddly damage, we don't really care about that. We care about these Shadow Blight procs, which are being increased by our decay damage. Then if we were to add on the Bone Prison, the rate at which this damage comes out is going up. We're going to add on the ability to crit, and then we're going to start spamming our Blight. Adding on all of this, you notice that all those little damage numbers kicking off this side are now in the 7 digits. With all of our bonuses up, we're able to very quickly proc multiple instances of multiple millions of critical strike damage per target, because this applies in an aura. It doesn't all need to be centered on one thing. As long as the monsters are within range of everything that we got going on here, we're able to stack on a huge amount of damage. But for something that can fairly easily farm tier 5, doesn't have a huge gear requirement. And on top of that, all of the gear that you'd be looking for is completely unknown to the meta, so it'd be incredibly cheap if you're somebody who's actually trading on something like Diablo.trade, and you could put this thing together fairly simply for next to nothing. So this little off-meta ball of absolutely ridiculous overlapping, mostly bugged and almost certainly going to get fixed in the expansion features, I think adds up to something incredibly fun, something most people aren't doing. And the interesting part about it is how much it has incentivized people's investigation into what's happening here. Because it's a weird thing. It's a very, very weird aspect. It itself doesn't really do damage, but it activates ridiculous stuff like this. To that end, I like to applaud the developers. It's very interesting. Again, I have a planner down to it below. I really don't think you should build this as your first character. It's definitely just a fun project for you to kind of dip into. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put it out there. I wanted to explain the mechanics, explain the bugs. It doesn't scale with minions. It only scales off of the Necromancer. The damage of the aspect doesn't matter. It's just how it interacts with the other things in the game that could net you some pretty okay DPS. Again, shout out down in the comments if you like it, if you tried it, anything that you've found, different interactions, cool ways of being able to build it. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.